and welcome to the TTS Neurodivergence in Education webinar. Throughout this session, myself and our panel of experts will be exploring how we can create a forward-thinking blueprint in which barriers to learning are removed and the impact that this may have on our children's learning opportunities is explored. My name's Becky Hawes. I'm an experienced teacher and have an extensive background of SEND. I'm now currently the proud head of service with Cadmus Inclusive, which is part of Cadmus Services and our Cadmus family of schools. Tonight, I am delighted to be hosting the latest TTS Talking webinar, which is focused around neurodivergence in education. So, this evening, our discussion will focus on exploring ways to lead with inclusivity at the very heart of education. We're going to be asking the question, how can inclusive environments enhance children's learning opportunities and offer guidance, inspiration and information for you to take away and put in practice to tomorrow's teaching? I'm really excited to say that joining me to talk about this incredibly important topic, we've got three superb experts who are going to be bringing their experience, their insights, and their understanding to the surface to help us make practical changes that will have a long-term positive impact. So without further ado, the very first expert that we have is Anna-Marie Hassel, MBE. I am delighted to welcome you, Anna-Marie. You're presently the Chief Executive of NASON, the National Association for Special Educational Needs and Disabilities. And this leading membership charity firstly exists to champion, connect and support those working in the education community. It supports from the early years to schools, post-16, specialist schools and wider settings. Our Anna-Marie has also held local, national and government advisory roles that span the breadth of education, children's social care, early years and SEND. We're delighted to have you along this evening, Anna-Marie.
Thank you very much for such a warm welcome, Becky. Delighted to be here too.
And in the middle of our expert sandwich here, we've got David Daly, who's a Professor of Psychological Intervention and Knowledge Exchange. Professor David Daly is a developmental psychologist and expert in ADHD and autism. And as of July 2022, Professor David Daly was appointed the head of applied psychological practice at Nottingham Trent University in the UK. David is internationally recognised as an expert in environmental modification for ADHD. He has authored over 160 academic papers and written 2 books on topics relevant to our important webinar this evening. Welcome to the panel, and it's great to have you joining us. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Becky. I'm delighted to be here.
Okay, and last but by absolutely no means least, the final piece of bread in our expert sandwich, we've got the wonderful Andrew Whitehouse. So Andrew Whitehouse is a TEDx speaker and Bamford lecturer. He's a specialist in neurological diversity. It's easy for me to say. He provides intervention for professionals, parents and young people with autism, ADHD and related needs, as well as behavioural-based interventions. Andrew's roles include the provision of training, strategies and interventions for educational professionals working in early years settings, schools and universities. A very warm welcome to you, Andrew. Welcome to our panel.
Thank you very much, Becky. It's a joy to be here.
It's really great to have you all on the panel this evening, and I'm excited to hear your thoughts and perspectives. I've got a number of questions I'd like to ask you, and I think what I'd really like to do is to think right from the beginning. So Professor Daly, I'd like to ask you that before our children even enter our school environments, what do you think our parents and our carers can do to help their children be ready for the first steps in their educational journey? And what can we as professionals do to help?
So it's a great question, and it's a really important thing to raise. I think what we can do as professionals is help parents to understand more what is going to be expected of their children, so that their parents are then able to practice those things and understand more about whether their child is truly ready or not for school entry.
I think it's really important to get to know what is that setting like and what is expected of that child. And actually, is that realistic for this child from their unique starting point? And how do we get there? And I'm guessing, I'm wondering, as professionals, are there any top tips there you'd say, these are things you can really do to support that family in assessing that?
I think if the parents have suspicions that their child might be neurodivergent. So some children with very classical severe autism would have a diagnosis prior to school entry, but the vast majority of children, and given how hard it is to get into services these days, would not have a diagnosis by their age of 4 or 5, but their parents may have concerns around social communication, or maybe it's around attention or impulsivity. And so the other thing that we can do as professionals from the outset is to be open with parents, to say that we want to hear about their concerns about their child,
yeah.
and that as professionals, we would take on board any concerns the parents might have and try and truly accommodate for those difficulties in an educational environment. It is quite bizarre that sometimes parents are still fearful of sharing their concerns with schools for the fear that their child will somehow be labelled incorrectly.
And that's a really important point. And Anna-Marie, I'd like to bring you in at this point to this part of our discussion. Often, when I lose a little bit of perspective, I take myself into the newish nursery setting, and I go in and spend some time with the tiny humans, and they give me my perspective and my sense of clarity and my purpose and my why back. So in terms of what Professor David Daly is telling us about working with parents, it's about the children as well. So how do you think we can work with pupils to develop a real understanding of what their needs are as part of a strengths-based approach?
Yeah, and I love that you're talking about a strengths-based approach, Becky, because I think that mindset, that principle of working with children, very young children, parents and their families, to start with assuming that the strengths rather than issues is absolutely the right place to start. And with young children, it's giving the space, the opportunity for communication, in whatever way that comes, for communication to be supported, to give the child agency. And that takes time. So sometimes it's slowing down to give the space for the child to express, whether that's through pictures, through verbal communication or other means. I think that's absolutely crucial. So building that in an early years setting is vital. Ensuring that the environment is welcoming and child friendly. We make an assumption that it's going to be that way, but in the early days of transition into nursery, earlier setting, or even into school, there can be an opportunity for children to have that free flow space, that opportunity for them to have softer surroundings, and space for their parents, if that's appropriate in the setting, for the parent or carer to spend time with them. So slowing right down and observing how the child comes to the setting rather than making an assumption about how it's going to be. I think that would be start point number one.
Yeah, and I think it's involving those children in that actually, and getting to know them and their voice, isn't it? And so you've talked there very much about creating the right environment. And Andrew, I'm turning to you now. It's kind of your turn. I'm thinking about you with your teaching hat on, and the fact that you regularly go into our environments to observe our children at the heart of their learning. I wondered if you had the opportunity to create utopia, the perfect future-proof classroom. What would that look like to you?
Oh my goodness me. Okay, right. So number one, it's the impossible question, because I think you need to look at the individuals in every environment and build it around them. So, but I'm going to move away from that, and I'm going to try and be rigid in a perfect environment. And I'm so pleased you asked me this question, because one of the things that I try to get across to education professionals, particularly when we have young people who maybe don't want to be in the classroom or don't want to be in school, is to say, don't think of the environment as that classroom. The minute I arrive at a school and someone buzzes me in through the gate, I'm in the environment. It's the whole place. It's the field, it's the corridors, it's the hall, it's the sports area, it's the forest schools at the back. It's all of those places. And so firstly, do not be confined to that environment being just the classroom. It's the whole thing. The second thing is really to think about how children are engaging with environments. And for those children who struggle to engage with environments, for whatever reason, think about how we're going to get them in and don't rush them. So, you know, I might say something like, let's let the child go wherever they want around the school within safety, reasonable safety, and try and get them into class, actual classroom, 10 minutes every hour, 5 minutes every hour. This is all movable numbers, and just be in there and just see if they like it. With the people, I want an open mind. You know, I don't, 99% of the time, and I'm not a mathematician, but 99% of the time, maybe I'm getting positive feedback on ideas and things I would like to put in place. But every now and again, I hear phrases like, well, we're a mainstream secondary, so we don't need to do that. Or, no, he doesn't need this because he's in top set maths. Or those kinds of sort of reactions. I have an open mind. I don't have a vision of what autism is, a vision of what ADHD is, or PDA, or any of those things. What I have a vision of is who is that person? Who is that person? And putting in place more of what works and less of what doesn't, and reading the environment. What bits aren't working? What bits are working? And totally build on those things that are working.
I'm loving the fact you're coming from that child-led. What are they telling us, and how do we respond to that, as opposed to this is this little round hole we have and then you go to that. And I think at this point, Professor David Daly, I'd like to come to you in terms of thinking about, we create these, as Andrew said, environments, learning spaces for our children. I'm wondering if we're seeing an increase in the way that the children deal with that environment in terms of the sensory needs and the filtering out all of the information that they're taking in from around them. And I'm wondering, is that something we are seeing? You know, is there a thing there that backs up the fact that there is an increase in children's sensory needs? And in terms of designing our learning environments, how can we support pupils effectively with that?
So I think we are seeing increased sensory needs and difficulties among particularly primary school children, because increasingly, unfortunately, our children are more stressed and more anxious than they used to be, and so the need for sensory feedback is in part the way that children cope with that increased stress and anxiety. And so we should really be seeking ways to promote children to gain access to sensory feedback. And I absolutely echo what Andrew has said. The key thing, first of all, is that children feel they have some sense of autonomy and control in the school environment. But actually, there are lots of children who are neurodivergent who need to know that they can go somewhere if they feel that they need it. So ADHD children may be bored and they may want to move around the classroom. An autistic child may feel under threat and may wish to go to a safe, secure little hidey hole and recharge. And if they have to ask permission, then actually that drives anxiety. But if they're able to just do it, if they have the autonomy and the permission to be able to do it, then that actually promotes self-regulation. Rather than disrupting the teacher or the class, they're able to just go and do it, and they're able to meet their own needs. And likewise, in terms of other forms of sensory feedback is a really great way of regulating behavior. And if they have access to sensory tools, then they can just go and get some sensory feedback. And it's really not that difficult in this day and age for there to be a variety of sensory products in the classroom. And how can we encourage them to self-regulate? How can we give them access to a variety of different sensory needs in a way that not only meets the needs of those children, but also meets the needs of all the other children in the class, because it's in a way that it's not disruptive and it's not necessarily commanding all of the teacher's time.
Yeah.
Yeah, go on, Anna Marie.
I was just going to say, can we come in and applaud and support, you know, what we're each saying, because I absolutely just subscribe to where Andrew started and where David's picked up. You know, the whole person-centered approach, that really is, I think, quite critical to success in school. Something about it needing, though, to be a whole school approach. I think it's important that the whole of the environment, you know, whether it's from the school gates through into the classroom, but that all of the school are subscribed to working in that person-centered approach. So it doesn't vary from one classroom to another, and that all staff are working together. You know, at Nathan we call it the whole school approach. I know we didn't coin the phrase entirely, others subscribe to it too, but that whole school send approach, I think, is more effective, and with person-centered individuals absolutely at the heart of it. And when you can get to know those individuals, understand their likes, their dislikes, and what works for them when they have a sensory need that they might really benefit from certain resources that are around the spaces and the places where they are in school.
And I think, you know, the things that I'm going to echo that sentiment, they're not difficult things to provide. They're small, little, tiny adjustments that can make the biggest things. I always think of those small differences that make the big difference. We don't necessarily need a £15,000 sensory room, but we can, on that child's table, give them their own regulation station using lots and lots of small sensory resources as part of a wider sensory diet. And I think the interesting thing for me is we can get the things and the stuff on the tables. We can get the whole environment. So the journey from I'm through the gate at the start of the day to I'm out of the gate at the end of the day can be crafted carefully around our children as groups of humans. But as teachers, we've got to get it right. And I'm finding that, especially some of our early career teachers, they're coming in with boundless enthusiasm from a good place of wanting to get it right for our children, but sometimes can be a little bit worried about going off piste or not following the school's policies. And at this point, for me, it's about helping them and giving them permission to do what's needed for our children in an intuitive and responsive approach. So at this point, Anna Marie, I'd like to ask you sort of the top 3 skills that we think as educational professionals we need to be sharing in order to be able to meet the needs of the diverse group of learners that we have in front of us.
Yeah. Do you know, I'd really like to reframe this as it's not so much the skills as the mindset. And starting off with the belief that children come to the classroom with strengths, and a belief that they can and they will succeed is absolutely critical. And we know that there's research that tells us that the mindset of the practitioner, the teacher, of the teacher assistant in the classroom is absolutely critical to the success of the student, you know. And I won't necessarily cite particular pieces of research here, but I think that mindset is number one. So that's the can-do approach, and the understanding that all pupils will have strengths and they'll also all have needs when it comes to learning. But then secondly, it's an openness to keep learning themselves. So that practitioner being receptive and open to learning, to be reflective practitioners, and collaborative, and open to continuous professional development and learning, so that they and their colleagues can explore a variation of approaches, pedagogy, and talk about that together to create the safe spaces for practice, so that there can be learning as already qualified and experienced practitioners to keep learning within the workplace and have the safe space, whether that's in the classroom, whether that's outside of the school environment, but most certainly to keep that learning journey alive. And then thirdly, you asked for 3, relational skills. You know, I think being able to have those positive relationships with the pupils, with the parents, with the families and their colleagues is really critical, that relational approach and that expectation that that is part of the role, and having, maybe it is a skill, the skills to being able to work effectively with parents and other agencies in partnership really is quite key to being able to support that learner.
And I think for me, it's definitely that the village approach, isn't it? It takes a whole village to raise a child, and we're all accountable for that. And I think in the raising of the child, it's not just about getting the environment right and the people right. It's, well, what do we teach them then? It's that curriculum. And for me, Andrew, this is where I'm hoping to bring you in at this point.
Okay.
I think we are teaching our children for a future that we don't yet know, which is kind of scary but also exciting. And so I'm wondering, what do you think we need to be focusing on with our children to give them the best possible chance to be learners for life?
Okay, so you've really hit on something that I'm absolutely passionate about. Again, this is twice you've nailed it for me. So I go every year to the BET conference at Excel, and I go to the BET conference. I call it my works outing, and I'd quite happily bunk my children off school and take them with me so they can have a play with the 3D printers and the VR machines and things like that. And I come away absolutely, totally inspired. I think the last time I went, I dissected a frog in virtual reality and I swam with the sharks. My son, who's a drummer, one of my sons, played an invisible drum kit, which was just sensors on his hands and feet, and and it's just amazing. And then, and I'm going to start to be a little negative, I go to school on the Monday morning, into a school, and there's a spelling test or handwriting practice. And you think of this technology that we were looking at, the PyTop, building computers, little children building computers to do exactly what they want them to and things like that. And it gets described as the technology of the future. But how can it possibly be the future if I've just been playing with it? It's the technology of the present. But as you quite rightly said, as we move through time, there is a future we know nothing about. And if I could teach children one skill, just one thing, it wouldn't be English, maths or science or history or any of those things. It would be research. It would be how to find things out, because that's the world we're living in now.
And then I think at this point, that for me is very exciting, because if I've got the research skills, there's nothing I can't discover.
Absolutely.
Which I think is empowering and exciting. And I think at this point, David, we sometimes can describe learning as this social experience. And something we need to think about here is making sure that we're able to support children to develop those skills as well in terms of learning in a social way. So how do you think we can enhance those skills for our children and support children who might find that aspect of learning difficult?
Well, I think, sorry, first of all, just to say, as a professional researcher, of course, I completely agree with Andrew that research is the present and the future. I think in terms of education being a social experience, I think what's fundamentally important for children at schools is the what's in it for me. So, when they do history, and it's always the tutors for some reason. You know, what's the point of knowing, you know, the 6 wives of Henry VIII? What's in it for me? And quite often in our education system, we kind of expect children to buy into the long-term benefit of it, struggle through day after day, week after week, year after week of, you know, drudgery in the classroom, and you will get a great job when you're 18 or 21, or you will get to go to university and you'll be able to buy a house and have a mortgage. But, you know, if you're 6 or 7 years of age, and particularly if you're neurodivergent and it's more of a challenge to be in a learning environment for you, then what is in it for me now? I can't conceive of 14 years' time. And so really it's about helping children to do that inquiry-based learning, to learn in a way that makes sense to them. And it's about encouraging them. I think, as Andrew said, it's about making sure that we have the facilities and equipment to be able to do that. But also, I think, particularly for neurodivergent children, it's about careful placement of them within groups in the class or the school that will facilitate that inquiry-based learning in a productive way. So teachers do need to put a little bit of thought and effort into how they create learning groups, little discussion groups or inquiry-based learning groups to solve a particular problem. They need to put a bit of effort into, you know, what group is going to be best for this particular neurodivergent child. And there will be lots of children in the class who will work very well with this particular child. There will also be some children who really won't work well with them, and they just need to be sensitive to that. And if they're not sensitive, they'll certainly, as a teacher, they will learn through trial and error, because they'll get it wrong and the whole thing won't work, and they'll swap the children out for a different pairing or a smaller group.
And I'm guessing within that, it's about building that child's ability to self-advocate, because I know there are certain people I work very well with, and I know there are certain people that maybe aren't the best fit for me. But as a grown-up, I'm socially aware, I hope, enough to be able to make my excuses in a socially acceptable and polite way. But when I'm 5, it's like, no, thank you, off I go. Andrew, what are your thoughts there?
I was just thinking as well that, and I absolutely, I'm having the most inspirational evening listening to all 3 of you. I really, really am. And one of the things when we talk, but just a little add-on I felt, David, was when we're talking about that social thing, we have to put ourselves in that social circle, you know. And I often say to people, this is not my world. This is not my world. I don't understand the new ways of learning and the technology behind it and all these things. It doesn't have to be my world, you know. I have a little play with things like Raspberry Pi and all that stuff, but it doesn't have to be my world. What it has to be is that we have to facilitate it being their world. So we're like, it doesn't have to fit me. I'm very happy, you know, I'll retire in a few years, I'll be fine. It doesn't have to fit me, but we have to pass that baton on to those young people and listen to them in their little social world and find out where they want to go. You know, it's not about us.
And I think, interestingly for me with this, it's about the fact that sometimes we can get into we're trying to create a little ready-made product, because you want to be an accountant, and you want to be and we have ideas of what those things look like. But now I think our world of work's changed completely, especially post-pandemic. We really have reconceptualized many ways in which our professionals are delivered and what that finished product looks like. So it's more now about the workplace, but the workplace being almost anywhere in the world at all. So Anna Marie, I'm wondering, in terms of our children, what do you think are the most transferable things we can teach them in readiness to be part of that global workplace now?
Right, so the world of work, or I would say also citizenship, that actually starts right in the early years, so all the way through school career, you know, not in the latter teens, that sort of preparation, that skills development, and I actually think it's more about softer skills, relational skills, rather than particular mastery of particular aspects of the curriculum. And I would like to say, I mean, really 3 things: self-confidence, an understanding of self, of where they have true strengths, you know, their own profile, you know, just what works for them, and being able to advocate that, you know. So then that final strand there is self-confidence, and I think those 3 elements are absolutely crucial. And if we can encourage children to have that self-confidence, knowledge of themselves and their own strengths, that, and a positive take on that sense of self, then that's a terrific starting point. And it genuinely does start in the early years, when children are building some of those first friendships and feeling sufficiently valued to feel that they deserve to have friends and friendships and relationships. And something very important as well about each stage or phase, from early childhood through school, post 16 and so on, towards that trajectory of meaningful employment or whatever their chosen path should be, is also the phase itself is important. It's not always about achieving and getting to the next step. It's about being in the moment too. And that's really important. And by doing that, then we can facilitate children having a positive experience in the moment. It's not just a hurdle and a hurry to get to the next step. And so therefore then they can succeed in the moment, as well as building the independence. I think earlier on, as panelists here, we're talking amongst ourselves about some of the points we might want to get across this evening, and I felt that one for me was also one about children and young people being supported to be independent, that, you know, from a perspective of identifying additional needs, special educational needs, disability, the aspect of independence is really crucial, and sometimes we don't realise that by being very supportive and caring, that we're not always fostering the necessary independence, so that a child or young person doesn't have an over-reliance then on the parent, the carer, the adults in the education setting. So important that we think about what are the steps to independence, and believing that they can be that independent person in later life.
And I think it's looking at the fact that we've had a shift in our education. I know I talked to my father-in-law, who's in his early 70s, and he talks very much about, we learnt the longest river in Nicaragua and the highest mountain in Mogadishu, and we chanted our facts. And then when I talk about, oh, well, I've spent today supporting some children with their social, emotional, mental health needs, he's like, really? That is a thing? You do that now in schools? We never had that in my day. And at this point, David, I'd like to ask you, bearing that in mind to get to this point where Anna-Marie and Andrew are talking about with this relational approach for our children, I'm guessing as a top researcher, what are some of the changes and shifts in education that you've noticed that are perhaps positively impacting upon our approach to neurodivergence in the classroom? You know, thinking that through from early years onwards.
So I think there has been some improvement, and I do think that teachers are more aware of neurodivergence, and more curious and willing to try and make adjustments and accommodations for children who are neurodivergent. And I do think the teachers actually deserve to be congratulated for that, because actually it's not covered in their teacher training. So, which is bizarre, and I don't know why it isn't, but it's not. So all of these teachers have had to try and gain access to information and understand what neurodivergence means, you know, through going on CPD courses or doing their own research. So we still have some way to go, but that is definitely has improved a lot. I think the other thing that has improved is there has been a mindset change in schools around the use of sensory tools and fidget tools. So 5 or 10 years ago, it was very hard for me to convince schools to allow children to have things like resistant bands, these giant rubber bands that you put around the legs of the chair so that ADHD children can fidget quietly without disturbing anyone and actually concentrate on what's going on in the classroom. And now it's much more commonplace, although not still universally accepted. And I think the next problem is not getting schools to see the value in those things. I think the next challenge is now who's actually going to provide them. At the moment, they're quite often provided by parents, and it would be great if actually they would become just part of the overall school's budget and part of something, part of what Andrew was calling the environment. So they just become part of that school environment. And there has been this huge increase in understanding. For me, I think the gap probably, and this would be a call out to people watching, is lunchtime supervisors. They often do not have a good understanding of the needs of these children, and they often see these children in the most difficult environment, because if you're neurodivergent, quite often being out in the playground during lunchtime, it can be more challenging. More things can go wrong. And we really have never invested in the right kind of training for lunchtime supervisors to be able to equip them with skills to manage what is quite a difficult job. You have a couple of hundred children running like crazy around a playground, and you're generally, poorly trained and badly paid. So I would say actually there are people who deserve more support and more training, because they manage difficult situations. And often when things go wrong in school for neurodivergent children, it either happens during the lunchtime recess, or the starting point happens in the playground. And then because the child is upset or anxious or triggered, it gets carried into the learning environment and something goes horribly wrong.
I think you're right, they're an important group of professionals that spend a long time with our children over the course of the week, and we kind of give them the power of the tabard and not much else, don't we? Andrew, over to you.
I'm sorry, I just got a few things that I picked up on.
Yeah.
Think of me as an inspired delegate rather than a contributor. Just looking at some of the stuff that you were talking about, Anna-Marie, I've only got 4 things I've written down. They'll be very quick. I was taught very early on in education about the magic F word, and you were talking about the magic F word, which is flexibility. And I thought that was really lovely to hear it. And also, you were talking about living in the moment. And I read something in that wonderful academic text, Instagram, a few days ago, and it said, if you spend your time looking forward to the future, you'll never live in the moment and you'll never enjoy what you're doing. And I just thought I'd share that with you. You'll be delighted to know, David, that a lot of schools I'm going into now are buying those things. They are buying the fidgety feets and the timers and they are just, I'll go in and I'll say, look, have a look at this or have a look at that. And they'll go, right, yeah, we'll get half a dozen of those in for school. And and I've talked classes into having timers, and where we've had a whole school where everyone's got a timer so the children don't have to sit for too long. And just finally, very, very quickly, you'll also be delighted to know that I'm working with a school in Cumbria who, when I deliver training, everybody comes. Lunchtime supervisors,
brilliant,
site staff, governors, everybody comes because everybody's meeting with those children as far as that school's concerned.
And yes, picking up on that, Andrew, it is about the theme of inclusion by design, so that when we're setting up our school, right from the mindset through, it isn't an afterthought, it's a proactive, well, what do we do? And picking up on what you said from the inspirational Instagram, for me, you talked about it's living in the now, the moment, because we've got to get that bit right, and that every interaction is an intervention. We've got the opportunity every time to make a difference. I'm interested to hear, Andrew, based on what you've seen, do you actually think we're moving in the right direction now to help our pupils be ready for what's to come? And so we're getting the moments right. And what's good now and what might we need more of?
Okay, right. So the education, I think, is like a big old ocean liner that takes a long, long time to turn. But just from a sort of personal experience, so for those of you who don't know, I am diagnosed with ADHD, apparently severe ADHD. So, but anyway, whatever type it is, and I've noticed a difference in how people communicate with me. So this is not about me, but so for example, maybe 10 years ago, I wouldn't say that to a school. You know, I wouldn't share that. Now I get booked sometimes because of it, because I have that. So that's a real sort of inclusive attitude and outward looking attitude. And it is true, because sometimes I go into these environments again and I'll pick up on something that maybe someone who doesn't have those thought processes, and I'm being very cautious not to generalize, because you know what we say, you've met one person you've only met one person and all the rest of it. So, but I think people are picking up on that. I think there's always something. So I remember, you know, back in the deep dark history and a very long time ago, when I was a teacher and I didn't know I had ADHD, so we'll put that to one side, when they would say, oh, Andrew, you've got a boy with ADHD coming in September, and I wouldn't sleep all of August, you know, and now we can kind of work with it. Most people know how to work with it. They know about attention spans, and they know about movements, and they know about movement breaks, and they know about dealing with special interests and things like that. But there's always something we're just behind. So for me, you know, people are great at ADHD now, and they're pretty great at autism as well most of the time. But now we've got PDA, and people are going, oh gosh, what are we going to do with this PDA? And they won't sleep all of August. And when we've nailed PDA and we think we know what we're doing, we never know 100%, there'll be something else as well. But I do think we're moving in the right direction, in as much as diversity has become this hugely significant part of our life, whether it be about race, gender, sexuality, neurodivergences. It's just absolutely celebrated now. So we can only be going in the right direction, I'm sure.
And there's two important words there that I want to pick up on that my son is very passionate about. And my son has autism and developmental coordination disorder. And he came to me one week being very cross because it was Autism Awareness Week. And I said, well, what's the problem with that? And his take on it was, well, you don't need to be aware of me. I'm not going to jump out from under the bed. I'm not a biohazard. And we had a conversation around the differences between awareness and acceptance, which was really interesting. And part of me was really excited that I'm raising a little advocate for himself, and, you know, someone who will stand up loud and proud and shout. And I think, Anna Marie, I'd like to ask you at this point, how can we support that shift from awareness, which is still a good thing, to acceptance and understanding?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely spot on there, Becky. It's more than a subtle shift.
Yeah.
Raising awareness and having an understanding of differences, which we've talked about earlier, should also be seen as a strength. The real shift needs to be not just acceptance, but a mindset which is about creating a sense of belonging. And so I think awareness, acceptance, belonging, that is the absolute fundamental shift that we really need to see in our schools, in our classrooms. And we have absolutely seen such change in practice, and the inclusive practice that I see now, when I'm just thinking back, 15, 20 years ago, I would say was more akin to integration rather than inclusive practice actually within the classroom. So I think training is everything. I still don't think we're there in terms of initial teacher training, that it isn't sufficiently embedded within initial teacher training to equip teachers to be able to go into a classroom prepared for the very mixed cohorts, the range of learning differences, and that, as we heard from Andrew, can lead to some sleepless nights and concerns about can you find within your knowledge of pedagogy and development, can you find it within your knowledge, the skills, can you find what you need to be able to support that child, that young person in the classroom? So I think training is key to give practitioners the confidence that they need, but also training that encompasses, I talked earlier about a whole school approach, and we've heard from others about the importance of a whole school approach, thinking about who's actually there in the playground over the lunchtime period, who's in front reception, who's in the classroom, whether they're leading the learning, supporting the learning. Everybody equally needs to be able to experience that training. And so it will come as no surprise that from a NASEN perspective, that we really think continuous professional development and learning is absolutely key to help us to make that shift from awareness, acceptance, to really truly being able to create that sense of belonging, and being able to do that without fear that one doesn't actually know everything. Again, mentioned earlier about the need to have the safe places to have discussions as practitioners, as that whole school, and to be able to then seek out the additional information, to ask the questions, and to be able to reflect on what has been tested out and reflect whether that's been a positive experience, whether it's for the school, whether it's for an individual child, whether it's for a particular need, and being able to create that opportunity for reflective practice is absolutely critical, and to include everybody within the school within those discussions and conversations.
And I'm guessing to achieve that, we've got to be good at spotting what we've got with the children that we have and how we might meet their needs. So I'm wondering, David, if you've seen maybe a change in the prominence of special educational needs in recent years, or perhaps increased groups of particular conditions or neurodivergence?
Well, we certainly have, for many reasons. Primarily, we're getting better at identifying neurodivergence in children. So just to, there is, for instance, for ADHD, there hasn't been a change in the underlying level of ADHD in the population in the last 50 to 60 years. There's excellent research for that. I won't bore you with to make that well understood. We're just getting better at identifying children with ADHD. We're getting better at recognizing their difficulties, putting an appropriate label on it that will allow us to accommodate that child. And also for autism as well, because we've managed to better understand autism and have a broader understanding of autism. There are lots of children out there who are autistic, but actually perhaps initially teachers wouldn't have thought are autistic because they seem to be able to, make eye contact and have friends and engage. It's just that those children do that in a deep masking way. So they're able to do it, but it's, exhausting. And they go home absolutely exhausted every day from masking. And when they no longer feel able to mask, that's when the problems start to. I also think what's really interesting, just picking up on Andrew's point, I do think that pathological demand avoidance is the next major thing that schools are going to have to get their head around. And there will be lots of children with PDA in schools that the schools have not identified that they have PDA. They will just be really difficult children who won't do anything. They're very non-compliant, they're often quite aggressive. There may not be a problem for schools for that long, because quite often PDA children actually disengage from, they won't go to school because just the parents asking them to go to school is a demand. And teachers will need very specific help and training, because it is possible to manage PDA, but you do need a lot of help and supportive advice to actually make demands of children without making demands of children. So,
yeah,
you know, so if a child has to fill in some sort of worksheet and that's the task in the classroom, then just telling them to fill it in is a demand. So of course that child's not going to do it. So you have to do it in a much more circuitous, clever, slightly amusing way. You have to say something like, those empty boxes look really lonely, and they're saying they want some, you know, pencil in them. You know, some way where you actually remind the child of what it is that's expected of them without making a demand. And teachers will need lots of explicit training on that, because it is very difficult and it's so easy to get wrong. And as soon as you start making demands of PDA children, of course, they either explode or they shut down. So, so I don't think PDA is something where we can expect teachers to train themselves in how to manage these children. They're really going to need proper explicit help and support to get it right. And if they get it right, then those children will do much better in those more inclusive, neurodivergent friendly environments.
And yeah, and at this point, Andrew, I'd like to ask you then, so where do you think the gaps are most visible in education for our children that are recognised as having a special educational need, and what perhaps could we be doing to address that?
Right, okay, so this will go back to an earlier point that I made when I said I'm very interested in what Anna Marie had talked about with labels, and I think it's a double-edged sword, because we have, if first of all, you've got, with a label, you've got two assumptions. The first assumption is this diagnosis accurate? Because often they'll be done in a different environment to the environment that child is used to. So that's your first major point. And the second point is that, is this diagnosis the only thing that's going on? You know, and when you look at instances of comorbidity, I mean, it's just absolutely rife. You know, it's no shock to sort of see a child presenting with four major you know, differences. And so I would go back to that point of observation, looking for where the difficulties are and plugging those gaps, that what I talked about earlier, is more of what works, less of what doesn't. I think also, in answer to the same question, is that what I tend to see is this odd one out thing. And I see this, I've been in 5 schools in the last week, and each child that I've been, these happen to have been one child observations, they are the odd one out, and that's because of the way that they are being managed. And they, you know, we need to create peer groups for these children. We don't, it must be awful being the child that's always in trouble, and the child that's always standing up, and the child that's always walking out of the classroom, because they don't want to. Nobody wants to be disliked and annoying, or whatever that, you know, that's happening in that situation. And it you know, if we can create some more sort of peer support for a lot of our children with different needs, I think that would be the negative effect on the self-esteem of a child for being different, and so visibly different, when it's so easy to change that ethos, so easy to change that ethos, and so easy to just look at that person and say, this person's got different skills and this person's got different needs, and let's do it, but let's do it in a really productive and positive way. You know, I'm a man of many mantras, and you know, so I've said more of what works and less of what doesn't. How many times? Because I believe that.
And it is about having that positive, okay, what does work? Let's focus on that. And that's really important. Anna Marie, if I bring you in there.
Yeah, could I just say it's just a bit of a reminder to ourselves, you know, when we think, and I'm paraphrasing really from the SEND Code of Practice 2015, because that's the one we still have. I'm just aware that hopefully this broadcast will stay on the shelves for a while, so I'm referring to the 2015 Code of Practice here. But paraphrasing, so in the Code of Practice, it definitely made it quite clear that the purpose of identification is about working out what action the school needs to take, not to fit a child, a pupil, into a category. So there's something here about thinking about what we can often refer to as sticky labels. We label once and it can stick and stay with a child or a young person. And so categorical labels, you know, can be very descriptive, but equally they can be restrictive. And we ought to really think that's a construct that might be helpful at that point in time. But it's about identifying maybe a set of strategies that can be helpfully defined, that strategies, interventions, support that might be a positive, might bring some support to a particular situation, rather than allowing them to sort of constitute or to limit who the child is and where they can go. And it's just, I think we have to remember that ourselves, because while I really celebrate when we're talking about neurodivergence, because we're bringing together a number of what otherwise could be individual categorizations, and recognizing that there's a whole range of differences that will be deemed to be neurodivergent. And it's a reminder that it's not one label for a child. It's a helpful way for us to be able to categorize certain characteristics and certain challenges, but not to forget about that child who carries strengths and positivity, and their neurodiversity is a difference, but it's not necessarily a negative to be sorted.
And sometimes I think it's about approaching it as it's not a learning difficulty, it's a teaching difficulty / challenge, actually, because it's not about me making you a different you, it's about me as your teacher finding the best way for you to learn and working in partnership with you to arrive at that. And David, I'm wondering, sort of from your perspective, we're moving forwards and I'm loving all the messages of hope that I'm hearing this evening. Do you think, you know, we're hopefully at the back end of a pandemic? Have there been learnings from that pandemic that we can take forward for the future for learning?
I think there are. I think the major thing that we learned from the pandemic is that it is possible for schools to totally change the way they operate almost overnight, to generally make it a success and make it work. And so to anyone watching this who, you know, is interested in the concept of inclusion by design and who wants to ensure that their school is a fully inclusive environment where neurodivergent children's needs are met seamlessly, then actually it's not that difficult to change the way they operate. And don't perceive barriers, don't think, oh no, we can't do that because we have to focus on, you know, some new way of delivering teaching maths or literacy. Actually be courageous, be ambitious, and start to make the changes to create that inclusive environment that we've all been talking about.
And I think there's a really important point you've raised there, because I remember I went from being sat in front of 30 children to teaching from an ironing board, holding stuff up at a computer and making it work because you had to and because you wanted to. And it was so precious to see my tiny human faces through the magic of the internet and to be willing to do it in a different way.
Exactly. And I think also, I think from the pandemic, I think the other thing that is helpful for schools is that parents did learn just how challenging it is to educate their children and how there is a real need for professionals to do it. But also we also I think lots of schools could see how the changes that they made in response to infection control, how it actually impacted on the learning and behavior of some of their neurodivergent children. So for some, the changes I think were really helpful. So being in a bubble was actually a really good thing for an autistic child, because your environment was very predictable, and it could only be that one teacher, because they weren't allowed mix with anybody else. They couldn't go to the staff room, they couldn't swap somebody out who was in a different bubble. So that made their environment more predictable, and that would have made them more relaxed at school, and probably make it easier for them to learn.
Yeah, and I think it really is about looking at what is good and celebrating that, because there is an awful lot that is good, and building on that, isn't it? Because sometimes I find that our colleagues in education can be so negative about what they're not doing, and actually there is an awful lot that they are doing that is really successful, and it's sharing and celebrating that and recognizing it, which is why sometimes it's more about maintenance and innovation, holding on tight to that because that's really good and adding a bit to it, as opposed to this is wrong, let's fix that. And I think as a closing note for me, Andrew, I'd like to give you the very last question of the evening. If we're thinking about our children, what are some approaches to take to teach children in our classrooms what it actually means to be neurodivergent, and what the beauty and the magnificence of that can be?
So it's about looking at different skill sets, and I'm not going to go down that cliche road of all our autistic children are geniuses and things like that. I mean, everybody has their own skills in their own way, but you just really hit the nail on the head then when you said that they need to be recognized as being different, but different in a positive way, and so just looking at things just from a different angle. So if you've got a child that is constantly doing things that maybe get on your nerves a little bit and are distracting other children, then that to me is a need of attention, and to give that young person opportunities to find the right kind of attention. So if they're throwing stuff about, then get them to be that person that hands out the books. I've got, my work is not very structured because every day is different, but there are certain things that I do look at every day. And one of the things is I ask is, are there special interests involved? Well, how can we integrate that? It's really important. I was somewhere recently where the class was reading Goodnight, Mr. Tom. And there was this lad at the back, and he got his hoodie up and his head down, and he really didn't have any care for Goodnight, Mr. Tom whatsoever. But what he'd done was he'd written this kind of scrapbook about monsters that he'd invented, and he'd written about their sort of special features and all the rest of it. And I said, have you still got that book? And he went, yeah, I've got that. I said, get it out. And we went and sat in the corridor. Now, the lesson, they were looking at adverbs and verbs in Goodnight, Mr. Tom. And there were plenty of adverbs and verbs in his dinosaur book. And that's the kind of thinking that what's the way in? There's always a way in. Every child has got a way in. Finding that way in, it's a gift from the heavens. School is the most diverse place you will ever go to in your life.
And that is a fantastic message just there, isn't it? School is the most diverse place you'll ever go in your life.
Absolutely, and I believe it. I absolutely believe that. But it needs that diversity as its foundation.
And I think that's it. You've given us that final closing note, haven't you? Diversity needs to be in a school's foundation. So we have to live by this inclusion by design. Wow, I could go on for hours with this. It's wonderful to spend so much time with like-minded people. I've really thoroughly enjoyed talking to all of you. And I'd like to say to all three of you, a thank you so much for joining us this evening for our talking, TTS Talking Neurodivergence in Education event. We all know how important this subject is, and hope that you have found this session useful and inspiring. I think as an educator, the key takeout for me has been this message of hope for the future. And I think there's a little mantra that I've been repeating in my head while you've been speaking, which is this awareness, acceptance and belonging. And it's important that our schools become safe and secure communities for all of our children, regardless of what their needs are. So I'd like to close by saying a huge thank you to our terrific panel of experts. It's been my pleasure and privilege to be in your company this evening. Thank you so much for watching. We'd love to hear your thoughts and discussions from this event. Please do share your thoughts by tagging us on the TTS social media channels at TTS Resources. And thanks again. We look forward to hearing from all of you very soon.